Right, okay, welcome to A2 revision for the approaches. So this will be one of the topics that is on paper 2, the approaches that you'll need to talk about. You'll have a section on it. Don't forget, the most important thing with approaches is that if at any point you get stuck, just think about the issues and debates: free will versus determinism, nature versus nurture, idiographic versus nomothetic, reductionism versus holism, gender issues, gender bias, cultural bias, any of those things, and you can evaluate those. It's not as good as having evaluation points that you have a lot of that you've prepared for, that you can back up and explore in more detail, but they are really useful if you get stuck, if you're thinking this is a 16 marker on this, I need a bit more detail, I need to know a little bit more. So please bear that in mind. Okay, we're going to go through the essay plan for each one of these. Now if you're watching this, listening to this in session, I'm pretty sure I'll have explained it to you, but hopefully what the plan will be, if it's still the same, that you will watch one of these videos. You will create a list of two lists of questions. One list for me, so anything you need to check you're not sure of, that you don't understand, and one list for students, so as a way of checking their knowledge. So you'll have a list of questions and a list of answers for students, so to help them revise. And of course everyone else will be doing other ones for other videos, so you'll have a huge range of revision resources, ways of testing your knowledge at the end. Okay. So first one, we're going to talk briefly about Wundt, who was the father or the founder of psychology. It's very unlikely, well, it's absolutely no chance that you'll get an evaluation question on Wundt, or you really shouldn't unless I've been misled by the examining board. But you talk about how he's really significant. Why is particularly significant? Well, he moved psychology away from philosophy into a science in itself, psychology, and the way that he did that is by conducting controlled experiments. He was completely revolutionary within the psychology philosophy field because he conducted empirical research, direct experimentation and observation in controlled environments. Also in Leipzig, Germany, in the 1870s is where he opened his first School of Psychology. His first labs were opened, which is obviously is related to the fact that he did a lot of controlled research. And he studied things like reaction time, sensory processes and attention. Hopefully you recognise all of those. They are all things that are currently studied by the cognitive approach. So it's internal mental processes, which is a really revolutionary thing to have studied at the time. Okay. And as you know, the response to Wundt was behaviorism, which is where they said, oh no, we can't look at internal mental processes, it must be observable behaviour only to make it as scientific as possible. However, Wundt was still the first to conduct any kind of research, so that's pretty impressive in itself. The way that he did that was introspection, and that's directly from the Mark scheme, systematic analysis of your own conscious experiences of a stimulus. So what I asked you to do was things like look at a video, listen to some music, look at a picture. With the ASs this year, I asked them to take various different things out of a plastic bag. There was sandpaper, there was a piece of paper with perfume sprayed on it, and they tried to analyse and understand and experience that as much as they possibly could from all of its component parts. So there it says of sensations, emotions, reactions. So physically, how did you react? Don't just explain it, oh, it's scratchy, it's soft, whatever it might be. You need to say that what that kind of experience had. So for some AS students, they felt they had cotton wool, and they said that they felt their jaw tighten, they felt their teeth tingle, whatever it was, because they didn't like it. Other students, there was a sweet, and they smelt it, smelled very sweet, so it immediately made them kind of, my mouths water a bit. Did it bring back any emotions? One of the perfumes reminded someone of a perfume that their mother used to wear. All of those things. So that's introspection, and that was the first way of exploring it in detail. And a little bit more information. They're highly trained assistants. Obviously, that's key for standardisation, to remove objectivity, to remove bias, making it more objective. And the really famous one, the ticking of the metronome, and consider how that you would respond to that. And that's it. And again, that's from the spec, so maybe pause and have a quick read of that paragraph. And Wundt concentrated on 3 areas of mental functioning: thoughts, images and feelings. And these are still based on the cognitive psychology. So they're studied in cognitive psychology today. The way that we think, the way that we perception, the way we view things, the way we understand things, and feelings, so the emotions that we experience. And as you know, we've talked about depression in cognitive. And his massive contributions because of controlled conditions and experimentation that was conducted, and that led on to behavioural psychologists who continued that. They thought, this is brilliant about Wundt, he does lots of controlled experiments, we need to take that and build on it. And then paved the way for later research, studying of mental processes, as we said again. So the key people that he influenced were the behaviourists and the cognitive approach, with the two significant paradigms. So remember we talked about the word paradigms in Features of Science, the significant ways that some set of assumptions that most psychologists agree to for the future of psychology. So he's incredibly significant. We've got the behaviourist. So the behaviourist approach, we've got that all behaviours are learnt from our environment and our stimulus and response. Classical conditioning is learning through association, and you know lots of this already. We've got the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So Pavlov and then there was stimulus generalisation, which isn't relevant to Pavlov, but we could use. So you had Pavlov, who's the unconditioned stimulus. In dogs, the natural stimulus, the thing that naturally without any training caused a response, was food. The natural, the unconditioned, the unlearnt response was to salivate. The neutral stimulus, the bell, was paired with the conditioned stimulus of the food, which eventually led to the conditioned response of salivation, suggesting that the learnt stimulus had now become the bell or the tuning fork. Okay, stimulus generalisation was little Albert. So he had the rat, and through association he learned to associate the rat with loud noises. So fear, started to cry, developed a phobia of rats. Went further than that. It wasn't just rats he developed a phobia of, it was everything white and fluffy. So he didn't like rabbits, didn't like cotton wool, he didn't like Santa's beard. So you could talk about little Alberts as well, to give examples of that. And also the key thing here is read the question really carefully. Remember back to that exam paper we looked at previously, you must give examples linked to human behaviour. So you don't just want to talk about Pavlov, you must link it back. However, you have to balance that really carefully, because you want to talk about little Albert, but you don't want to make it sound like you're talking about the two-process model for psychopathology. So keep those very, very separate and be very, very careful with those. Okay. Then you've got operant conditioning, which is learning through consequences. So you've got positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. And Skinner conducted that research. And again, you must remember links to human behaviour, but you can start off with Skinner with his rats and with his pigeons. So positive is adding something, negative is removing something, reinforcement is increasing a behaviour, punishment is decreasing a behaviour. So positive reinforcement, you add something to increase a behaviour. So Skinner's rats, one of them accidentally pressed the lever once, and then food fell out. So that was and then from then on, the behaviour of lever pressing increased. Food was added, positive, the lever pressing behaviour increased, reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, removing something to increase a behaviour. So there's the dog who stood on the electrocuted floor, and when it stood on that was constantly electrocuted, and when it stood on a certain section of that floor, the electrocution stopped. So giving the dog some relief. So negative, removing the electrocution. In reinforcement, the behaviour that was increased was, understandably, the dog would then always stand on that certain section of the cage. So negative, having the electrocution removed. Reinforcement, increased behaviour of standing in the top left corner, or whatever it was. Punishment, decreasing a behaviour. So you can have negative and positive punishment, don't worry too much about that unless you'd really want to, because it's the same concept of adding or removing something, but punishment is decreasing a behaviour. Being told off, so you stop talking in class. Having your homework removed, so not having any homework to do, so you increase if you finish all of your work in class, so if you stop talking in class, things like that. So punishment is decreasing a behaviour. Think, do we want that behaviour to continue? No, so it's decreased. For example, we don't want children swearing, so we'd punish them for that. We'd decrease the behaviour, we'd tell them off in some way, put them on the naughty step. We don't want students' attendance to be poor within college, so we do to decrease, but think about things we do to decrease those behaviours. If it gets really serious, do we contact parents? Do we put people on disciplinary? Do we meet with people one-to-one regularly? All of those things, they'd be punishments because we want to decrease a behaviour. And then Skinner, so we've got Skinner's rats, we've got Skinner's dogs. Briefly, you could mention Skinner's ping-pong playing pigeons. However, you would need to think carefully, can you remember how they were reinforced? And again, you must link it to examples of human behaviour. Children are a perfect example for this one. Okay. And then you've got AO3, so all of the evaluation points for the real world. Almost every single theory has real world applications. You can take them from phobias, OCD and depression. So real world application is systematic desensitisation, and you'd explain a little bit about that. the most important thing you must do is you must link it back to the theory and explain, so what, who cares that it has real world applications? You must explain that it has real world, the positive thing about theory, if it has real world applications, is that you can apply it to the real world and actually see that the claims that you are making are effective, that they work, that they are correct, so therefore that increases the validity. Also, if it has real world applications, you have more of an opportunity for falsifiability, don't you? So the opportunity to test and identify whether it's true or not. So you can only disprove things, but you can pick it apart to see if there's anything that doesn't do that. So if you make a claim like systematic desensitization works because it's reconditioning, it's counter-conditioning a fear, and then you would say, right, okay, so let's test that. So you'd actually do some systematic desensitization and see how effective it was. So it allows us to falsify claims from theories, and it also shows us, hopefully, that the theory is valid because the research, treatment or whatever it might be, is effective. Link back to the theory, link back to the theory, link back to the theory, link back to the theory. Okay. Cannot explain why some behaviours are easier to condition than others. So there are some behaviours that very, very quickly will develop phobias too. So think about all the popular ones. You've got spiders, you've got, or you can broaden it out to this, but really phobias is probably the easiest one. You've got spiders, heights, snakes, all of those things, and it can't explain why those behaviours are easy to condition, suggesting that the theory lacks validity. Remember, theories can only lack or have validity. They can't have ecological validity, temporal validity, and so on and so on. Really, it's much easier. It's probably better to avoid using those terms and just talking about validity. So that would be a brief evaluation point. How do you extend it? You'd add a however, and you talk about Seligman, who said that there's the concept of preparedness. So the idea that if a behaviour is helpful to our survival, then it's easier to condition and to learn. So it makes sense that we would very easily, with a very small negative experience, develop a phobia of spiders. It would be very, very illogical for us to very quickly develop a phobia of buttons. It could happen, but it doesn't really automatically support our survival, thinking about the evolutionary times that don't think cave people had buttons on their clothes. Okay, so then suggesting that later editions developed the validity of the theory, and once again features of science. So they reassessed, they re-looked at their theory construction, they tested it, found that it didn't work, so it allowed it to evolve and supported it that way, which is very scientific, which is very positive. Experimental research conducted in here was all very experimental, highly controlled lab experiments. They used animals which allowed them to reduce extraneous variables, so mostly they used male lab animals to reduce the fluctuation in hormones. The environment was controlled. Pavlov measured how much the dog drooled based on drops of saliva, so it was very, very precise, operationalised, removed objectivity and bias, suggesting that the research the theory is based on is very valid, and therefore we can be confident in the claims that the theory makes, or we can be confident the theory is backed up with effective empirical research. However, they use non-human participants, which is issues with extrapolation. Humans and animals are very, very different in a variety of different ways. What you must do to get the key marks here is you must talk about how they are different. So animals do not have free will, whereas humans do. We have much more complex social environments, much more complex environments in general, much more complex brain structure, and particularly we have free will and choice. We can choose cognitive processes that they don't consider, so we can choose whether to take part in a behaviour or not, rather than just responding to the stimulus. And again, determinism would be a good one here to talk about. It's quite deterministic and quite reductionist, and of course you can talk about both that in terms of strengths, in terms of weaknesses. So particularly reductionism, so it reduces everything down to a very simple environmental reductionism, which is what we talked about, so stimulus and response, which can cause problems because of course we ignore other factors. The fact that if you think about social learning theory, there's the role of mediation or process, so we ignore cognitive factors, we ignore free will. However, by reducing it down, we are able to test and measure behaviour and consider it in that way. You would not be expected in the 16-mark question to include that many evaluation points. Evaluation must be effective to get your full 16 marks. So it's not about the amount of evaluation points, it's about the depth you go into. And I'd say 3 or 4 is the most that you would need for the behaviour, or for any of the 16-mark essay questions for the behaviourist approach, or in fact any of the approaches. But it's the depth, okay? Point, example, explain, however, all of that detail and that knowledge. Borrow terms for validity, falsifiability from features of science, okay? Next one, we have social learning theory. So this is learning through observation and imitation in a social context. So the idea that we observe certain people and therefore in the right circumstances we imitate their behaviour, and that is the bridge between the behaviourist approach, which is all about purely environmental stimulus and response, and cognitive approach, because the social learning theory does acknowledge that there's a combination, an interaction between environment and environmental responses and also cognitive mediational processes. So these are some of the key terms. You've got a role model, which you must identify with. So a role model is somebody that you would copy or you would model your behaviour against, and the chances of you doing that are increased if you identify with that person. So this will be two things: so that you're similar to them in some way. So for example, if you're the same gender, the same age, you're related, the family, and also if you aspire to be like them. So for example, we've got footballers who have lots of money, glamorous lifestyles, they're in the newspaper a lot, lots of girls, whatever it might be, and they would be a role model because you aspire to be them. But also you also say if you're quite good at football, you would identify with them. You'd identify them with their gender, the fact that they're from small local towns possibly would allow you to identify. So you can see links between the two. Then you've got vicarious reinforcement. So this is observing the consequences of somebody else's behaviour and deciding if you would want to imitate that behaviour. So for example, if we think about with the Bobo doll study, then if you observe somebody who is rewarded for acting aggressively towards a doll, actually a better example might be a video game. So if you observe your video game character being given points, or I don't know, whatever it is that you get for playing video games and you kill people, and then you would think, oh, that looks good, that's also something that I would want to acquire. In movies, people are very violent, and then people respond by liking them, so that's a positive consequence, by them getting the girl, by them getting money, whatever it might be. Think like really old stereotypical kind of 80s action movies, Sylvester Stallone and stuff like that. Could also be things like children observing criminal behaviour, so somebody sees their older brother drug dealing and then getting lots of money from that, having lots of friends, looking very cool, so they also want to do that as well. The same can also be said for vicarious reinforcement in the opposite. So if you observe somebody who is punished for something, so if you see somebody speeding, you see they get caught, they have to go to court and they have to pay a fine, you're less likely to speed, hopefully. Same with, I don't know, so maybe you could use the example, if we're kind of using people you might identify with, maybe you could use the example of the Playboy bunny who not so long ago shared videos of without somebody's knowledge of them at the gym in the shower getting changed, and said some very unkind things. She's now been taken to court, and I think she's being asked to pay a fine and possibly some community service. I can't really remember, but it's the basic idea that you should then be put off from doing that. So vicarious reinforcement. And then we have the role of mediation or process. So that is the thought process that goes between observing the behaviour and deciding whether you're, and then imitating it or not, as the case may be. So in between observing the behaviour and your behaviour. So the first thing you need to do is you need to be able to pay attention to it. Then you need to be able to retain it, and that's usually more likely to happen if you identify with the role model. Reproduction is how confident you feel you could reproduce the behaviour. So that could first be physical attributes. So for example, if you're observing somebody weightlifting, and you're not very physically fit, then you're perhaps less likely to consider that you would think that you'd be able to reproduce it. So physical attributes, but also kind of your own understanding. So you can think, yes, I could do that physically. I would be capable of doing that as well. So confidence in, say, your academic ability or whatever it might be. And then motivation, so how motivated you are. So essentially this is whether they got the reward or the punishment. So if they were rewarded, you think, yes, definitely want to do that, that looks really good. Or if you were punished, you think, no, don't think we'll try that. That's in the green-haired girl and the pink-haired girl, which are all in 270 if you want to come and get a copy of those at some point. There'll also be information on the internet as well. That isn't something we covered in as much detail at AS. Okay, and then AO3, so I wouldn't mention at any point during social learning theory Bandera's research. You could save that for AO3. You don't get as much, many marks for talking about research in theories in the AO1 in this topic. Okay, so Bandera's research, you could talk about the Bobo dolls and the fact that they showed people aggressive and non-aggressive models, and the children were more likely to imitated whichever model they saw. So they were more likely to, if they saw an aggressive role model, they were more likely to be aggressive themselves. And also the same with vicarious reinforcement. If a role model was rewarded, they were more likely to imitate whatever behaviour they displayed, aggressive or non-aggressive. Whereas if they weren't rewarded, or if they were punished, then they would. Sorry, if they weren't rewarded, they were less likely to mirror the behaviour, and if they were punished, they were even less likely to mirror that whatever, or imitate whatever that behaviour may be. Same thing as always, you must link it back to the theory. So Bandura's research is, this is strength of social learning theory because it suggests that Bandura's research supports the ideas of, we could talk about identification, vicarious reinforcement, talk about some of the terminology there, and then link it back to the theory. So this suggests that the theory is supported by empirical evidence, and highly controlled empirical evidence, so we can be confident of any suggestions that it makes. Supporting evidence, you've got Fox and Bale, since you've got the person who is more likely to imitate a behaviour if they're observing a virtual model that looks like them. So that links with identification. So that's the strength of learning theory because it's another piece of research that supports the concept, one of the concepts of social learning theory, identification, there. And then we've got cause and effect, or causality. So with this one, it's the idea that social learning theory doesn't necessarily says A leads to B, so we observe violent behaviour and therefore we become violent, and it doesn't actually acknowledge that there could be a variety of other reasons. So it might not be that we observe a criminal behaviour and then become a criminal because of it, we imitate that behaviour. It could be that we're drawn to people who are more criminal because we are criminal ourselves in intent. So if you think about it at school, so it could be a combination of the two. So if you think about it in school in year 7, the kind of people that were drawn together, they were all very similar, possibly similar in similar ways. So there might be the naughtier students were drawn together, it might be that the harder working students were drawn together, and then I suppose you could argue from there it'd be a perpetual circle that people who are similar are drawn together, and therefore then their behaviour, they observe criminal behaviours and that behaviour is reinforced, and they're going to continue to do that. But it could be, it's not just that observing criminal behaviour leads to criminal behaviour. There's also the argument that you are drawn to people who are similar to you, so you might already be criminal and taking that criminal behaviour into that situation, which obviously is a problem for the social learning theory because it suggests that it's reductionist, and therefore can't be applied as effectively. And then we've got that it ignores other factors, so for example testosterone, and that links in with nature versus nurture. So boys were consistently found to be more aggressive than girls in Bandura's research, even if they were showed the same, even when they were in the same experimental conditions, which suggests that there are some gender differences that are due to nature rather than nurture. Potentially you could argue that of course boys and girls are raised differently, which would be a problem. So it ignores testosterone, it ignores biological influences, which again suggests that it's not a completely valid piece of research because it can't explain why the difference between all behaviours. Link it back to the theory. And then you could argue that it's not deterministic because it acknowledges both environmental and cognitive factors. So it's not deterministic like the behaviourist approach. You are rewarded for something, you will do it. Or you observe something, you do it. It suggests that there's a role of mediational processes as a factors considered in there, which increases the validity because it's a theory that kind of considers all factors. That's it. Oh, and then we've got describe and evaluate the cognitive approach. So with this one, you've got internal mental processes. So the cognitive approach explores and looks at internal mental processing and tries to measure that. And you need to know about inference. So because internal mental processes are not so, cognitive psychology is all based on the skill of inference, or the concept of inference. We cannot measure internal mental processes, so we must observe behaviours and then draw assumptions. And I think you've all done this one where it's the green ink. So we need to observe behaviours and then draw assumptions. So we see that problem solving takes longer. It takes a person longer to do a thing, so that's a behaviour. It takes them longer, we're able to measure that, to solve a problem if it's in green ink than if it's in red ink or whatever it was. And that suggests that, and then from that we draw the assumption that problem solving is harder, takes longer in green ink. We cannot crack somebody's head open and look directly into them. We can't see how problem solving takes place, so we observe behaviours and then make assumptions based on those behaviours about what's happening internally inside internal mental processes, that little black box. Okay, we have schema, which are a mental framework that help us kind of understand our way in the world, and that they have developed from experience. We are born with two innate schema, and of course you could talk about this without straying too much into developmental psychology. You could use all your knowledge from developmental psychology. So we were born with the schema of sucking and grasping, and they're the two schemas that we have, because of course they help us eat and stay attached to, I suppose at the time these were developed, the mother, so grasp onto the mother, or whatever we were whenever we were furry animals, can grasp onto the fur. And then they become more complex, so they go beyond physical behaviours that help with our survival into more complex things like how to interact with the social environment, how to interact in a social situation, what kind of environments to interact in. All of you have very, very complex schema for all three of your A-level subjects that you study. So for example, it would go psychology, year 1, paper 1, approaches, cognitive, schema, and that's how you'd lead it down if you think about how they're structured within your mind. So they're very complex. And then you have computational and theoretical models. So computational, multi-store model, working memory model, input, output, retrieval, all of that. So at the time in the 1960s, computers had first been developed, and psychologists could compare human processing to computers, and that allowed us to kind of think about it in a more scientific manner as well. And then theoretical models, so models that don't physically exist, so you can't crack somebody's head open and see ABC written inside. It's a theoretical model that allows us that gives us an idea of how things work, so thought processes work, and the ABC model would be a good example of that. And finally, we have the emergence of cognitive neuroscience, so cognitive internal mental processes, brain science study, so the study of internal mental processes within the brain. You could talk about Gage and Wernicke. So before, which you know all about, so before brain scans were invented, we had to rely on autopsies, which of course had their problems. We could only look at the structure of the brain. And the key thing to remember here, neuroscience, we're not just looking at the structure of the brain, we're looking at how the brain affects is involved with internal mental processes. So it's not just brain, because if you say it's just looking at the structure of the brain, what does it sound like? It sounds like biology. Cognitive neuroscience, so not neuroscience, not the study of the brain, cognitive, the study of internal mental processes and the link to the brain. And that's it. So it's internal mental processes. Gage and Wernicke, before we could look at the structure of the brain, however, and see personality changes when they're alive, wait till they died, and see what structure of the brain were altered or were different. So the same with language. Language is a cognitive process, an internal mental process, even though it creates an observable behaviour. And then Gage, personality, same thing as an internal mental process that we'd be interested in as well. Both of those, you had to wait for them to die and you had to look at them. So a big problem with that is that we couldn't look at active behaviours. We couldn't look at, active internal mental processes. We couldn't look at the brain processing things actively. We had to just look at abnormal behaviours and what the structure of the brain looked like. Brain scanning was developed, you can tell me all about fMRIs, PET scans, etc., etc. And there's a YouTube channel on that as well, video on that. So they were developed and they allowed us to explore the way that human processing worked. We could see active internal mental processes happening, which was very useful. And you can have a look in your notes about the different things we could look at. We could look at epilepsy, we could look at brain scans, we can look at Alzheimer's, all of those different things. Okay. We've then got real-world applications. As always, every single one has real-world applications. So you could talk about CBT, REBT, or DEF model, but you must link it back to the theory. So you must explain to me that why it's a good thing. Well, of course, it's a good thing because if there's real-world applications that are effective, that suggests the claims of the theory are valid. They are explaining what they claim to explain, and also real-world applications give us an opportunity for falsifiability. So if the treatment is effective, then we know that it supports the theory. However, the treatment isn't effective, then we can look at why that might be, and that allows us to kind of falsify the model and confirm whether it's the case or not. It's like another area of research. Scientific research methods, they use labs, they use brain studies that reduces objectivity, reduces bias, which increases objectivity, removes any extraneous variables, so we can be more confident of the internal validity of our research, and it's not influenced by investigator effect. Steal all the terms from research methods and different things. Extrapolation, human computers are very, very different. So humans and computers, don't have free will, they don't have emotions, they don't have complex social interactions. All of those things that suggest that any research based on that would lack validity and might not be as complex as we might like. Allow us to kind of explore as complex concepts. We can't be as confident with the theory, so always link it back to that theory. If the theory is based on research that's based on extrapolation, then that raises issues. The biological approach. So we have the biological approach, just that all behaviours have a physiological influence or physiological factors, and there are 5 different things you can talk about, the 5 different ways we research that. So we look at genes and we look at twin studies. You can talk about OCD here, you can talk about the CERT gene or the COMP gene, and the way that we explore that behaviour is inherited, which is something the biological approach also believes. So we look at twin studies, you've got MZ twins and DZ twins. MZ 100% DZ of DNA, DZ twins 50%, both share 100% of their environment or none of their environment if they've been split, which allows us to kind of tease apart nature versus nurture. The bigger the concordance rates difference between MZ and DZ twins, the more something is due to nurture. Apologies, the more something is due to nature, of course. So the bigger the difference, the more confident we can be that something is due to nature. So there's a very big difference between MZ and DZ twins. For OCD, then we can be confident that that has biological, physiological factors as a genetic fault, and we have been able to identify genes such as the COMT gene, the CERT gene, that link to that. Okay. And of course, you could talk about concordance rates. So concordance rate is the likelihood that if one twin displays traits of a condition, then the other twin would, or the similarity between the twins. And then biological structures. So they're things like the brain. So you can tell me all about the different lobes of the brain. They are the separate lobes squished together make a brain, and that is what a biological structure is. So it's separate organs that are all combined together to make a structure that works together. So you've got the brain, digestive system, fight or flight response, the endocrine system, the nervous system. All of those things are bits that are combined together, biological structures. So you could talk about fight and flight response, how that influences our behaviour. You could talk about the brain, how that influences our behaviour in certain ways, the different things. And then neurochemistry. So there we're talking about neurotransmitters, so chemicals within the brain that take messages to and from. That take messages around the brain and have influence on our behaviour. So you can talk again about OCD and depression, and the levels of low levels of serotonin, and OCD with high levels of dopamine, and how that might impact on our brain. So we've got inhibitory and exhibitory neurotransmitters. You know all about that. And geno and phenotype. Geno is our genetic makeup that we're born with. Phenotype is the interaction between our genetic makeup and the environment. That's really key that you know those 2 terms. You could talk about those. So the difference, the interaction between the 2. So we have a genotype that allows us to have brown hair. However, our phenotype is the interaction between environment and our genes. So for example, if we've got the gene that says we have brown hair, we're never ever going to have bleached blonde hair, we're never ever naturally going to have black hair. However, if we go out in the sun, that will make a difference between a very, very light blonde, or if we spend a lot of time inside in the dark, then that makes a very, very dark blonde. Same with weight. So you might have a genotype that always says that you'll sit around this genotype says you'll sit around this a weight that is very overweight. We'll probably never be very, 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 very thin. However, with interaction with the environment, you could reduce your weight significantly or increase your weight significantly as well. If you go to the gym a lot, you eat right, or whatever it might be. And then the evolutionary approach, you all know about survival of the fittest, and the idea that behaviours are adaptive. So adaptive behaviours are passed on to the next generation. So adaptive behaviours are anything that helps survive, and then that was passed on. The key thing you must make really clear is that adaptive behaviour allows an animal to survive and therefore reproduce, which then allows their genes to be passed on. So don't just say it allows them to reproduce, that doesn't mean anything. It allows them to pass on that gene, that adaptive gene, which then continues that behaviour. Then we've got scientific research methods, so same thing as before, brain scans, lab studies. They're all very scientific, so they reduce bias, maintain objectivity, so which reduces extraneous and confounding variables. Therefore, we can be more confident in the validity of the research. Link it back to and then link it back to the theory. You must link it back to the theory. If the research is if very reliable, objective, you can check the validity. It has internal validity. You can be more confident of the conclusions that are drawn. You can be confident that the theory is more has higher validity as well. So real-world applications with the SSRIs is the next one. You already know all about that. The idea that SSRIs block the transporters which take the cause the reuptake of serotonin to happen too quickly, making more serotonin available in the synaptic gap, and therefore able to bind to the postsynaptic neuron, the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, and have more of the effect that serotonin has. Once again, you would want to link it back to really important to link it back to the theory there. You must link it back to the theory. So the idea that if it has real-world applications, that we can be more confident that it's valid and reliable theory that suggests that low levels of serotonin is part of the reason for OCD. But also it allows for falsifiability. So if we can test and check for the check that the method is reliable, that the treatment is reliable, then we're able to falsify the theory. We're able to falsify the claims, check that they're not just false claims. We can never prove anything, but we can it can make it more difficult to disprove. So we can be confident that certain things don't disprove it as well. So you can talk about both of those things. So always link it back to the biological theory. And then next, other things we could talk about, the fact that it's deterministic. So obviously this isn't a good thing. It's the idea that if you have, for example, low levels of serotonin and high levels of dopamine, that you will automatically develop OCD. If you have the SERT gene, then you will automatically develop OCD, and so on. I'm sure there's probably some other things. Perhaps you've looked at aggression with Andy, maybe, and the different genetic explanations there, and you can use those in AO1 as well. So please don't learn anything new. There's no point learning new information. It's all about utilising the information that you have. Deterministic, whereas clearly that's not the case. So for two reasons, it has a negative impact. It can have an impact on people and the way that they view themselves, and whether the amount of effort, whether treatment will no longer be available. So if it was a biological approach, there would only be one certain type of treatment, the drug treatment, that would be available. People wouldn't take ownership of their conditions. That's certainly not to suggest that, for example, mental health or anger management is the fault of the person. However, if there's a cognitive element to it, it's really important that people feel that they have that control and that power to do something about it. And of course then that ignores the concept of free will, which is clearly something that humans have, or are quite keen to believe that they have, and therefore it ignores other factors that need to be considered, reducing the validity of the theory, once again linking back to the theory. And of course it's reductionist as well, so it only considers it's biologically reductionist. It's the lowest level of reductionism, which of course isn't a good thing because it doesn't consider other factors. The fact that there's very varied and we have very varied social and cognitive differences. So in general, there are other things that might influence it. So have you looked at other factors that influence aggression? Particularly, this would be a really useful one for aggression. So social learning theory would support aggression. The idea of the media would support aggression. I'm sure there's loads more that you could talk about than I can think of for that. So therefore, again, it reduces the validity of the theory. However, it's extremely useful because if we can reduce things down to its most simplest form, for example, biological approach, then we can explore it, we can empirically test it, and therefore identify potential cause and effect, and again falsify the claims. So features of science is a really important one there. Link it back to the theory. It's both good and bad. Next one, we have the psychodynamic approach. So here you could talk about the unconscious and the role of the conscious and the unconscious. You talk about the concept of the icebergs. There's a very small amount of our conscious, our thought processes are conscious and we're aware of them. There's a huge amount of the unconscious, and then everything underneath the bullet point, the unconscious, is related to happens in the unconscious. We are not consciously aware of any of those things. And Freud suggests that really important phrase, just like internal mental processes and cognitive approach, that it's unresolved internal conflict that influences human behaviour. So if you have unresolved unconscious unresolved conflict. So, and there's various different ways that could happen. For example, you've got the structure of personality, tripartite structure. You've got the id, the ego, and the superego. Remember the id, we're born screaming balls of id. That is the devil on the shoulder. If you want something, you just take it, and they're the basic human urges such as thirst, hunger, sleep, sex drive, any of those things. So if you were hungry, you saw a chocolate bar in the shop, you would just take that chocolate bar, you'd shoplift. That's the first thing that's developed. And then we have, that's what we're born with. Then we have the ego, which is the mediator to the id and the superego. So the superego is developed through the process of the Oedipus or the Electra complex, when you identify with the father or the mother, and that is where all of our morals are held. So you would never ever eat a chocolate bar because you didn't think you deserved one, you didn't think you were good enough, and the ego is in the middle mediating both of those. So it's trying to, the whole time it's trying to balance. So the id is the devil, super ego is the angel on the other shoulder, and then the ego is the person in the middle trying to balance those. And I think it was maybe Emperor's New Groove I showed you where they had that. There's loads of different things. Ideally, perhaps slightly more psychological examples than the Emperor's New Groove or any kind of Disney movie, but that's something that you could use. And then that conflict that ego tries to resolve is an example of an unconscious unresolved conflict between the id and the superego. And then defense mechanisms, you've got repression, denial and displacement, and we looked at those in lots and lots of detail. So remember, we looked at all the different videos. I think we looked at The Notebook was one. I can't remember what was that film that we ruined the ending of because he was experiencing one of the defense mechanisms with Leonardo DiCaprio in. Anyway, so you've got repression, which is where you repress all unpleasant memories or experiences into the unconscious. So remember, all of these things happen in the unconscious, and defense mechanisms are the ego's way of protecting itself. So repression is when you repress unpleasant experiences, denial is when you refuse to accept that something has happened, and displacement is when you take your anger out on something else. For example, kicking the cat if you're cross about college, work, I don't know, a poor grade that you got maybe, which of course would never happen because you're all excellent hard-working students. So they're the defense mechanisms, another way that they would influence behaviour. And then you've got the psychosexual stages, which is loads of detail in your book about these, so please return to these. You've got anal, orophallic, latent and genital stage, and that is where the Oedipus and the Electra complex happen. So within the phallic stage, between I think around the age of about 5, children, the Oedipus complex, as we know, Freud was much more focused on male than female psychosexual development and moral development, and he talked about the idea of the a young boy desiring the mother, wanting to sleep with her, and the father, and being scared of the father because he sees him as a rival. He's worried for some reason the father will castrate him. Who knows where that came from, but there enough. There we go. And he's also aware that he wouldn't be able to win. He's the weaker of the two. So because of that, he represses the memories of being sexually attracted to his mother, identifies with the father, and that's really important, identifies with the father and internalises his morals. Ta-da! Super ego. So there is an unconscious, unresolved conflict. So if something happened at that point, if the father left, maybe at that time the parents got divorced, somebody died, the mother left, anything happened, they were bullied, who knows, could be absolutely anything, then that would cause fixations and problems. And again, all of that is in your textbook, so do have a look at those. Electra complex, similar. The daughter desires the father, but is aware that she can't have the father, so identifies with the mother and develops a superego that way. Although Freud suggests that maybe because of castration anxiety, you can't fear the mother, and therefore you can't identify with her. So women have weaker morals, and then somewhere this fits in the idea of penis envy, so the idea that the women develop an envy of the penis because they can't worry about being castrated, and because of that they spend their whole lives wanting to acquire a penis, essentially. So they do that by giving birth to children. So that's Freud and the psychodynamic approach. And then we've got AO3, so I'm sure you can't think of any of the ways to evaluate this one, but some of the suggestions are practical applications. As always, every single one of the approaches we've talked about has practical applications. In this case, he was the absolute, possibly an unwise choice of words, but the daddy of modern day mental health treatment. He was the person who significantly radicalised it. Before that, people were still doing these awful medieval things, so drilling holes in people's heads, keeping them locked up because there was no support that could be offered, and he was the first person to suggest the talking therapy, which is absolutely revolutionary. It's the idea of discussing, so you could identify these unresolved unconscious conflicts and deal with them. And he developed lots of different ways of doing that, so free association, dream analysis, all of those, and of course that's extremely significant. Link it back to the theory, and it suggested it was a revolutionary theory. You could almost talk about paradigm shifts here, possibly, that we moved in mental health. They moved away from the idea of this being possessed by demons to treating things with talking therapy. There's supporting evidence from Fisher and Greenberg that you could talk about when they conducted research on the psychodynamic approach, and that's in your booklets. And of course, quite clearly, you can talk about gender bias. There's a huge range of issues with gender bias. So the fact that it's electrocomplex isn't well developed. Freud himself didn't consider women worth considering. What else? The fact that there was the belief that penis envy that women looking for careers was an abnormal behaviour. All of those things, which is a significant problem because, of course, Freud treated a lot of women. So it have a very negative impact on those women and their experiences, and potentially you could argue that that has moved on to mental health treatment in day-to-day life, modern day life now as well. Whether, I can't really comment on, I've not looked at a lot of research on that, but that is something that you could suggest potentially might have an issue. And of course, it means that it can't be applied to everybody, so it's a fairly ineffective theory. There's an element of lacking validity because it claims it can be applied to everybody, and yet it isn't. Methodological issues, he uses case studies a lot, which is a significant problem. You could talk about the strengths and the weaknesses, so it's a very idiographic approach that he looks at. However, it allows him for really, really in-depth data, and lots of qualitative data, which of course is perfect for considering mental health, which is a very unique and personal experience for individuals, rather than kind of trying to apply the blanket approach that maybe the biological approach does. However, very small sample, not representative, can't be generalised, potentially a child of its time. Hysteria was the idea that the womb moved around the body and caused women to act hysterically. There were quite significant sort of child of the time. The belief in mental health at that point was very significant within that. So you could do loads on case studies there, and of course, remember to link it back to the theory. So if the theory is based on research that's conducted on case studies, then it can't be generalised to the wider population. It calls into question the validity of the theory. So you could call into question the population validity of the research, which then suggests that there's problems with the validity of the theory. Remember, theories can only be valid or lack validity, whereas studies could have a variety of different things: temporal, population, etc., all those different ones we've looked at. So just be really careful with that. Okay, and then finally, the humanist approach. We have free will. So humanists believe that all of human behaviour is the construct of free will. So we are unique individuals who decide our own destinies, completely different to Freud. So if you wanted to talk about with Freud, in psychodynamic approach, you could talk about determinism as well. He's very much deterministic, the idea that if you were weaned too early in the anal stage, that all the way up to your death you would be a very sarcastic person, or whatever it might be. Whereas humanists think it's all about free will. And we make our own choices, and everything is currently in the present now. Okay, everybody is driven to self-actualize, to be the best they can be, to fulfill their fuller potential. So we are constantly motivated in the positive to self-actualize and meet our full potential as human beings, and that would lead you nicely onto Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you've got the different stages of Maslow's hierarchy, and everyone has to be met fully for you to be able to self-actualize, and you just want to be aware of those different ones. Okay, so you've got physiological needs, which are your basic needs, that thirst, hunger, sleep, sex, all of those, and then you have your safety needs. You need to feel physically safe. So if there's a fire in the corner of the room, or you live in a war zone, you're not going to be able to meet that so that you can talk about them as needs section within the hierarchy. And then there's belonging. So you need to be socially feel comfortable and accepted, love and belonging. Then that will lead to self-esteem. So you need to have self-esteem, self-belief, and then that will lead to self-actualization. So it's all very positive in comparison to the psychodynamic approach. The focus is all on the self and the idea of congruence. So if you remember, we had he talked about the circles, and there's self-image, which is where we think we are now. The ideal self, which is what we'd like to be. So if they're very congruent, if those two circles overlap, you think, I would like to be the kind of person that revises really hard, and you think, yes, I revise extremely hard, I do this many hours, and I feel very confident with that. Then they will be highly overlapped, and that will lead to high levels of self-esteem and self-worth. So how much you believe, how much you value yourself as a person. If they're very, very incongruent, so if the self-esteem, self-image and the ideal self don't overlap very much, then you have very low self-esteem, because you think, I'd like to be a person who revises very hard. I hardly do that. I hardly ever put any effort in. So I'm not meeting that. I'm not congruent. That's about perception as well. You could be the hardest working student in the world, but if you perceive that you don't work as hard as you should, that's when the problems arise. And of course, if you aren't congruent, or if you're very incongruent, so they don't overlap, then you cannot self-actualize. You cannot reach your full potential. And then we've got the roles of conditions of worth. So the impact on congruence, and whether we are congruent or not, could also be the idea of unconditional positive regard. So if we break that down, unconditional, there are no conditions placed upon it. So positive, it's good. Positive regard. So positive regard is a feeling of positivity, respect, love, affection for a person. That you highly regard them, you think of them positively. Unconditional positive regard means loving somebody without conditions. For example, so an example of unconditional positive regard would be accepting and loving your children regardless of their sexuality, regardless of how they do on exams, anything like that. Conditional positive regard would be, I will only love you if you are straight, I will only love you if you get A's, whatever it might be on your exams. Without unconditional positive regard, we develop a very negative self-image, and therefore it's very difficult to become congruent. And therapists, humanist therapists, are designed to offer unconditional positive regard to allow us to develop a more positive self-image, and therefore our ideal self and our self-image will overlap, become congruent, and that will allow us to self-actualize. That, what I've just said, that process there about the congruence things, is exceptionally important for the mark scheme. You must understand that, and you must be aware of it. So do listen to that a few times if you're not sure. Ask me if there's anything you're not sure of. And then the influence of counselling. So much like Freud was revolutionary, a humanist approach was also revolutionary. They developed person-centred, so it was no longer I am the therapist, I am the expert, I will tell you what to do. It was person-centred, so the therapist would merely be supporting and offering unconditional positive regard, but saying to the person, you're unique and individual, only you know how you can improve, let's discuss those ways and then we'll move forward together, rather than psychodynamic, this is what's wrong with you, you're very sarcastic, so that was because you were experienced something negative in the oral stage. Done. Okay, so it's much more holistic and kind of inclusive to the participant, much more positive and focused. The supporting evidence from Harter, which I can't remember off the top of my head now, it'll be in your books, it'll be in the textbooks as well, so if you want to refresh your memory of that. We have the fact that it's cultural bias, so self-actualization. This is where so the belief is that you're always aiming for self-actualization, whereas actually there are individualistic and collectivist cultures. So individualistic cultures are all about achieving the best that you can be, being employee of the month, whatever it might be, whereas collectivist cultures are always about the greater good for the group itself. And you have individualistic cultures are usually England, America, European Western cultures, whereas Eastern cultures such as Japan, China are possibly more all about focused on the group, supporting the group needs. So of course self-actualization would not be relevant, and Maslow's hierarchy isn't relevant, and there are actually alternative versions of Maslow's hierarchy which have been suggested. I think it's by Nevin, who talks about what the differences should be and what self-actualization would look like in a collectivist culture. But of course, ultimately on the surface, this suggests that the humanist approach is flawed, because the suggestion is that self-actualization is the aim, the motivation of all humans, and that is not clearly not the case, not because they're lazy or whatever, but because of cultural differences. It also rejects scientific research, so because we're all individuals who are completely unique, then there's no point in conducting nomothetic research. You can't collect a huge range of research because we're all unique and individual. You can't develop general laws that you could apply to everybody. So therefore, because of that, we can't be confident of cause and effect. We can't conduct empirical research to identify cause and effect. We can't conduct empirical research to allow us to falsify the theory itself. So identify whether it can be proved, whether it can be disproved or not, and therefore developed and reformed and kind of moved forward and continued more. It's very ideographic, so it's all focused on the individual. So again, it's all about case studies, so that's similar to the psychodynamic approach, which is difficult. Can't develop general laws, which you can't apply to everybody. And that is it. Okay, thank you.